Good morning, sixth graders, and welcome to your first unit. This is going to be still life drawing. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at how to draw objects in proper proportions, proper scale, and also how to show light and shadow to add a level of realism and three-dimensionality. All right, moving on to the next slide, if I can. There we go. So your EQ, that means your essential question. Your EQ is how do artists create work that is pleasing to the eye and engages the viewer? So this is the question you're going to be thinking about throughout the entire unit as you watch these videos and as you actually start making the project itself. We want to know how to make our artwork engaging, how to demand the viewer's attention. So let's see if these slides can help you answer that question and figure out what that means. All right, so still life drawing is your first definition or your first vocabulary word. The definition is a drawing or painting of arranged objects. And down at the bottom right, you see the arrangement of a teapot, a shoe, and a cup. They were arranged in a set order in an intentional way for the artist to draw that would create a level of interest in the viewer and to the artists themselves as they draw it. Because what's the point of drawing anything if you're not actually interested in it? Your question is, how can an artist arrange a still life to be engaging to the viewer? So normally you'd be in class and I give you a minute to think about this, but since we have this video, I'm going to kind of walk you through what that question means. To make a drawing or a still life specifically engaging to the viewer, you want your objects large and in the center. You don't want them very tiny and off to the side because the viewer won't be able to really see it. And if you have more empty space, which is called negative space, than your positive space, the objects that you're drawing, it doesn't create a level of interest for the viewer. So you want to make sure everything is large and in the center. A lot of times coming to sixth grade, students have the habit of drawing really tiny with details, and not only does it not fill the paper, but it actually makes it harder on you, because when you draw small, it limits how many details you can actually add. So the bigger you draw, the better. It's better for the artists themselves and also better for the viewer, and it makes it more engaging. All right, moving on, we have proportion. Proportion is a relationship between two parts in the whole. Now, this is kind of a complicated definition. If I were to say this to you in class, you probably all look at me thinking, what did he just say? So I have these pictures to help out. When it says the relationship between two parts, so if I look at this mannequin, which is a spin-off of Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketch, if I compare two parts, so the arms, for example, if I compare the two arms and then compare them to the whole of the mannequin, the whole person, as long as they're the right size and placement, then it's in proportion. Whereas if they're not the right size and placement, it would not be in proportion. So if this right arm, or his left arm, however you want to view that, was too large or too small, it would not be in proportion, and we would need to fix it. And you would know how to fix it by comparing the length of it to the rest of the body. We innately know when we see something, whether it's in proportion or not, the question is taking the time to compare all the parts and creating those visual measurements to make sure everything is properly placed and sized. Same thing goes with his face. You can see the artist made all these measurements and markings to make sure everything was not only just the right size, but also the placement. You don't want something to be too high or too low, too far to the left, too far to the right. It has to be exactly where it's supposed to be, and you constantly go back and forth and make these comparisons between the different parts and the whole to figure that out. So why are proportional relationships important in still life drawing? Basically because you want the artist to be able to recognize your object for what it is. So over here, if this is supposed to be a bottle and two pieces of fruit, if this bottle wasn't in proportion, this could look like a flower vase or maybe a tall mug. So all these measurements are really important to creating that level of realism and engagement for the viewer. So proportions are very important. And you want to make sure that's the very first step you're taking when drawing really anything. You want to make sure the proportions are correct before you add any detail. So not only do we have proportions and line detail, but we also have value. Value is, for a lot of students, when I say it's shading, it's like a fancy word for shading. That's basically what it is. But the definition, the formal definition, is the change from light to dark. So here you have the value scale, or you have it slowly changing from white to light gray, to medium gray, dark gray, and black. For value, you need to have the entire range. Here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different values, or 7 different tints and shades. You want to make sure you use that whole range. If you only limit yourself to one one gradation there. It's like number 3 here, or yeah, number 3. If the whole thing was shaded in this color, you don't have the variation of the light and the shadow. You really want to look at the object and see where the light is hitting it and what shadows are being cast. So value is the change from light to dark. So how could an artist use value to make a still life engaging to the viewer? Imagine if this image to the right was just a line drawing. Would it be as engaging as this picture? The answer is no, because the value creates a light source, and it gives some type of form, even in texture and three-dimensionality to all the objects. I mean, even in the glass, you can see the light reflecting and the shadows being cast. It actually looks like a glass and liquid inside. This actually looks like a tin can I can pick up and throw in the recycling, or even a candy bar that I'd love to eat right now. But the value made all this possible. The artist paid very close attention to where the light was hitting it, which area of the value scale it landed on, and which tint or shade to add, and how much of it. So adding value makes the still life very engaging, and we are going to be doing that as well in your drawings. All right, so shape is a two-dimensional outline of an object. I mentioned proportion was the first thing you need to focus on. Really, figuring out the spacing and the placement with shapes is kind of one and the same. So the reason shapes are so important, we're obviously not drawing a still life of circles and stars and hearts, but you can use these basic shapes to map out where you want your subjects and the size of each section to make sure it's in proportion. So instead of drawing the face details, the eyes, nose, and mouth, you first want to figure out where the head is, and not only where the head is and the size of it, but how it relates in proportion to everything else. So you do this by drawing these very quick, these very loose shapes with your pencil, and then from there, once you're done the drawing, then you add the detail. If you are used to adding detail first, I challenge you to stop, try to do the shapes in proportion first, and then add the detail. So moving on, questions. How can drawing in basic shapes help plan out the space and proportions in your art? I basically just discussed that. This image over here shows the step-by-step production of how the artist created these pieces of fruit in this mug. So before, when it was just a blank white piece of paper, they first used the shapes to figure out the placement while also thinking about the size. And then they added other details. So this must have been the bottom of the pear, and then they added the top of the pear along with the mug. And as each phase continues, they're adding more and more line detail, and eventually they start adding some value or some shading to add that three-dimensionality. All right, scale is the size of an object in relation to another object. A lot of times students get this confused with proportion, but whereas proportion is relating two parts to the whole of one thing, scale is the size of one object to another object. So if one thing is too big or too small, it's not in scale. So the reason I like these images is because the chicken and the table and chairs are far too large, way out of scale compared to the way the world is. We don't actually have chickens this large. I would run for my life. And if we had chairs this tall, it would take us all day to sit up and have a meal. So the table and the chicken are not in to scale with the people as they would normally be in everyday life. So scale more has to do with the overall size. So why is the scale of objects important in still life drawing? It's very similar to the proportion slide, where you want the objects to come across as the objects they are. So if my bottle is, 1.75, inches from the top, or whatever that measurement is, it should relate to that in the drawing as well. Basically, the bottle should be taller than this cup, and it should be a little bit shorter than the height of the pear. You want to make sure you're making these little marks to make sure that your objects are the right height when you're placing them and when you're doing your initial drawing. Space is the distance or area between things. That's a pretty obvious definition, one I'm sure everyone will get right without even thinking about it. But in art, you want to basically think about space and how you're distancing the objects and how you're filling the paper. So sometimes you don't want your objects to be too close, sometimes you don't want them to be too far away, but you always want to make sure you fill the space of the paper to keep it engaging, which is basically addressed as this question here. How can the proper use of space help grab the viewer's attention? where if you compare this image on the left of these oranges compared to the right, the image on the right is far more engaging, grabs my attention far more because the space is so condensed, it's so filled up with all these objects that it makes me want to look at it. There's just so much going on. Whereas in the orange picture, there's all this empty negative space, which doesn't really grab my attention. All right, variety is differences in color, shape, and size, along with choosing objects to draw and even when you're adding the value and the line detail, all these things have variety. They're all different. Differences in variety in art help to add the engagement. When everything's exactly the same, it might not be as interesting to look at. So over here, you have all these yellow circles, there's variety in the size, but there's not variety in the color. Where on the right, there's variety in the color, but not in the size. So if you were to fuse these two together, it would probably make the most engaging image of these circles, where the circles are different sizes and colors and placement. So the more variety you have in art, the better. And then how can artists demonstrate variety in a still life drawing to grab the viewer's attention? We already mentioned that regarding the different objects you can choose, the different placement, the different angles, the different lights and shadows that are naturally being cast on them from the light source in the room that you're drawing it from. So all those ways is how variety can help engage the viewer. All right, so form is a three-dimensional object. When you add value, when you add the shading, you're creating form. You're creating something that's two-dimensional like this, well, even better yet, two-dimensional like this triangle, and making it three-dimensional like this cone over here. And even this box that's made to look three-dimensional line, adding the light and shadow makes it look even more three-dimensional. So if you were to take these objects and carefully shade it, you could make them look like these objects over here and make it look like they're actually popping out of the paper and has some kind of form and makes it look three-dimensional. All right, so how can value be used to create the illusion of form? Again, I just discussed that in the last slide. But here you have a famous artwork by M.C. Escher. He did create an illusion of hands drawing hands that are coming out of the paper. So you see the line detail and it's flat, but then as he added the value, it actually made it look like the hand was popping out of the paper. This is a really neat illusion, but when you create the light and shadow, it makes the artist think they can actually hold it and it's an actual tangible object. All right, so there is a still life video for you guys to watch. If you click on this link, you can watch the video, and I'm also going to try to embed it actually in another page, so look out for that. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to try to embed this video in case it doesn't work from this link. But that's the end of the slideshow. Just watch the video to kind of show you a step-by-step how-to basically compile everything that I just said in this video into an instructional lesson. All right, guys, I look forward to seeing your responses and seeing your work.